We're going to talk about boundaries and discipline. So you can't do a parenting conference without talking about discipline, right? It's probably the most common question that I, get. Do you spank? Do you not spank? Do you do time out? Do you not do time out? What are the kind of consequences that you use, for different types of behaviors that are unwanted? Get those kinds of questions all the time. So let's deal with boundaries and discipline. Let's go to the word first, Proverbs chapter 13, verses 13 through 16, and then verse 24. Whoever despises the word brings destruction on himself, but he who reveres the commandment will be rewarded. The teaching of the wise is the foundation of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. Good sense wins favor, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin. In everything the prudent acts with knowledge, but a fool flaunts his folly. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. One of the things that I really hope, just as an overarching concept for the day, is that you will see discipline as love. Discipline as love. We discipline because we love. Discipline is not the opposite of love, okay? Just kind of some parenting basics. So I'll remind you, particularly for those of you who have teenagers, the majority of problems that teens face have one fundamental similarity: the battle between the teen's desire for total freedom and the parent's desire for total control. So we're always battling against that. So what's the target of parenting? Not fear, but positive goals that promote life transformation. We talked about that all weekend. What's the process of parenting? So you never stop parenting, right? It's always dynamic. What works today may not work tomorrow. I wish that parenting were so easy, like I could give you a set of 5 principles. If you did these 5 principles all the time, they'd always work. But it just doesn't work that way, because every kid's different, every teenager's different, every home is different, every personality is different. And so some things that worked with Tatum, they don't work with my boys. Some things that work with one of my twins doesn't work with the other twin. And so there's a process to parenting where we're always learning, we're always growing, we're always adapting in a way that is most healthy for our children. A modeling paradigm for parenting, and this is the hardest one for, I think, all of us. Children won't do what we say, they'll do what we do. And so we have to be good modelers of behavior, okay? So we have to have that modeling paradigm. It's not just about what I teach, it's about what I demonstrate. The relationship factor in parenting. The stronger the relationship, the more likely they will obey and adopt our beliefs and our behavior. And so are we really striving to have a good relationship with our children? Do we want them to love us? Do we want them to like us? Do we want to love them? Do we want to like them? Not at the expense of making good decisions, but one of the reasons that I brought Tatum with me on this trip was I wanted to be able to spend time with her. I wanted to be able to invest in her. She's a young lady. She's 21. There's just some things that, she lived in England right after graduation for 6 months. She moved back. She went to school. She graduated. She's about to start. She was actually going to be with me all the way through the end of this whole, speaking engagement, series of engagements that I've got that go all the way through the beginning of May. She was going to be with me through the whole thing, but she ended up getting her first real full-time job in her career, and she starts on the 29th of April, and so she's actually going to go back early. But I wanted to use this opportunity kind of as a last chance to invest in her, because she's getting this full-time job. She's probably going to be moving out of our home soon, and so I thought this would be just a good chance just to be able to connect with her. The relationship factor in parenting. How relational are we? The outcome of parenting, life transformation, we talked about that. Foundational balance in parenting, discipline and love guide any parenting plan that we utilize. And so when we talk about discipline and love, there are 4 types of families, okay? 4 types of families. You'll see that under how do we discipline. And basically what we look at is we look at 2 axes of parenting, okay? So 2 straight lines. The vertical line, okay, that would measure, that would kind of measure our discipline level, that is our consistency in rigidness of boundaries and those sorts of things. And the horizontal line, it measures, kind of love and affection. So from one side to the other side would be low love to high love on discipline and boundaries, from low discipline and boundaries to high discipline and boundaries. And then we end up coming up with 4 families as a result of that based on where they plot on that grid. So if we have low amounts of discipline but high amounts of love, we would call that a permissive family. Okay, so basically we show lots of affection, but we don't ever do discipline. We don't ever do teaching. We don't ever do boundary setting. So it's just high levels of, we call that a permissive family. Basically, that kid can do anything he wants to be able to do, right? He's going to get lots of affection as a result of it. Doesn't matter what the consequences are. I'm not going to step in. I'm not going to intervene. Low discipline, high love, that's permissive. Low discipline and low love. So basically, a very disconnected, independent type of family. We would call that a neglectful parent. I had a very dear friend of mine. He actually lived with us whenever I was growing up. He moved in with us the last 2 years that he was in high school, and he grew up in this kind of family. Very disconnected. They kind of had a very independent, free spirit idea about, how they were going to parent. They didn't discipline him at all, but there also wasn't high levels of affection there. They didn't really, I think they loved him, but they never really displayed love. And so what that comes across is as neglect, right? You have to spend time with children. You have to spend time with teenagers. I wrote a chapter for a book, about 15 years ago, and we entitled the chapter Teens Spell Love, T-I-M-E, right? Our children and our teenagers, that equates love to them when we're willing to spend time with them. So that's a neglectful parent. The third is the authoritarian parent, and that's where we have high discipline, but we have low love. So we have high levels of expectation, we have high levels of correction, we have high levels of boundary setting and willing to step in to do corrective types of things, but we don't do it affectionately, we don't do it lovingly, we don't do it in a way that is highly relational. We would call that an authoritarian parent or an authoritarian family. And the last one is the healthy one. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for high levels of discipline, but we're looking for that coupled with high levels of love. That's an authoritarian parent, an authoritative parent. What we want in an authoritative parent is we always want to discipline, and we want to do it consistently, but we want that discipline to be both on the front end and on the back end. So not just corrective in nature, but instructive in nature. Discipline can't just be corrective, okay? We have to have both sides of the coin, instructive and corrective. And that leads us into the components of discipline. So Proverbs 3, 11, and 12. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resist his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those whom he loves. As a father, the son he delights in. So there's two Hebrew words that are used in this passage in Proverbs. One denotes the word words, the Hebrew word words, which is yakaj. And then the other one is actions, the word yasar. And so it kind of gives us two sides of the same coin. We want to have instructive words, and we want to have corrective actions. Instructive words, what do we teach? Corrective actions, how do we correct? When there is a behavior where our child, our teenager, drops the ball on something that we have instructed, then how do we follow that up? That leads us to the next page. How do we take corrective action? Let's start there. How do we take corrective action? Well, this is one of the things that I think where we fail as parents so often is when we correct, we don't have a process for correction, right? And this takes incredible discipline on our part to be able to do this. I'm a human being, right? Just like you are. And I would love to tell you that every single time that I discipline, that I do this process, but I don't. Because I'm a human being, and sometimes I just discipline out of anger just like everybody else, right? Your child frustrates you, you swoop in, you give them a pop, or you issue the edict like you're grounded from now until Jesus comes back, that kind of thing, where you're basically just, you're correcting, but you're doing it out of frustration. And you're doing it out of a reaction to something that they've done or something that they've said that you're reacting to and not responding to. So what do we need to do when we are corrective? When something goes wrong, how do we correct that? Well, number one, there needs to always have been, prior to correction, there needs to have been a clear warning. It's unfair for us to correct things that we've never instructed, okay? We need to make sure that our children and our teenagers understand what the expectations are. Now, some things it's natural for them to know and would be intuitive for them to know, but as a general rule, we always want to make sure that there's a clear warning there. This is what is going to happen if you do X, okay? Clear warning. So between step 1 and step 2, or component 1 and component 2, we're going to assume that there was an infraction. Like they knew what the warning was, they breached it. So then what happens? Number one, we need to establish responsibility. Now, can I tell you in my own life how many times I fail at doing this? We assume that our children have taken responsibility for their actions when we give them a correction. But you know, a lot of times when we give a correction, they're enduring the correction while rejecting their responsibility to that. And I want you to think about that for just a second. Sometimes they're enduring the correction, but the whole time the correction is going on, they're thinking, this is not my fault and it's somebody else's fault. And if we're correcting and they haven't established responsibility, they haven't owned it, the correction is never going to work because the correction isn't tied to their behavior. And what they're thinking is, well, you're to blame, or my friend down the street's to blame, or the circumstances to blame. And so they're never going to tie whatever the negative consequence is, they're never going to tie that to whatever the behavior was. We have to make sure when we give corrective action that they own responsibility. Well, how do you do that? How do you establish that? I make my boys, now because Tatum's, 21 and about to leave our house, but my boys at 13, whenever they get in trouble, I make them say to me, what was the expectation? What were you supposed to do? And I make them tell me what the expectation was. And then I say, what did you do? And I make them say what it is that they did. And then I will say, and whose responsibility is that? Is that my responsibility or is that your responsibility? And then I make them own it. That's my responsibility. Okay? So we have to establish responsibility. Do not miss this step. If you miss this step, I can promise you more oftentimes than not, when they're enduring the consequence, they are merely enduring the consequence. They are paying the penalty. And do you know in prison today, there are hundreds of thousands of people that are paying a penalty, and the penalty that they're paying is doing absolutely no good because those people who are incarcerated feel like they are incarcerated unjustly. It's somebody else's fault. And so it's never going to work because they don't feel like the punishment fits the crime. And they feel like a victim. And that's the way our kids feel sometimes. They're getting in trouble. I mean, you'll see this, right? My boys do this occasionally. If I don't establish responsibility and I just start correcting them, my boys will drop their head and they'll usually say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And basically what they're trying to do is they're just trying to get through the punishment, right? But they're not owning it at all. And it may even be internally that as I'm going through that and they're saying, yes, sir, it may even be that they're not only enduring it, but maybe in their head what they're saying is, I just really wish he would shut up. I just really wish we could move past this. And are they learning anything while that's happening? Absolutely not. They are not learning a thing. And ultimately, we want discipline to produce change. The purpose of discipline is to instruct and produce change. It's not punishment for punishment's sake. Okay? Ultimately, we want to do things that work. I don't know how many of you are yellers and screamers in your home. Like you get mad, you get frustrated, you raise your voice, you yell at your kids. We're a household that we can do that, okay? I told you earlier, Tatum would attest to this. Wendy and I both grew up in families where that's how you got your point across. The loudest person won, so you just had to be louder than everybody else. And so oftentimes in homes, we see families who they get really loud, but it doesn't produce results. And so what they think is, well, I just wasn't loud enough. So they get louder and louder and louder and louder. Or maybe you grew up in a family that threatens. I'm going to do so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, but that so-and-so never ever happens. So the empty threats don't produce results. And so oftentimes when we say we're disciplining, we're not actually disciplining because it's not producing change. We might be doing some things, but if those things aren't producing change, then it's not discipline. So we have to establish responsibility. Number 3, we want to avoid embarrassment. We want to avoid embarrassment. So when we discipline, we want to be very careful that we don't produce shame in our kids. And so there is something to be said for disciplining kids in front of other children as a means of being instructive for other children. But if you do that, you want to be very, very careful in how that's done. Because at the end of the day, we don't want the embarrassment to override their ability to be able to receive what the message is that we're giving them. And sometimes when we react and overreact too quickly, oftentimes it turns into a scenario. It turns into a scenario where the kid is so embarrassed that basically all they're doing is tuning out anything we're doing or anything that we're saying. And so as a general rule, and this doesn't have to be all the time, but as a general rule, you want to try as much as possible to discipline one-on-one, okay? So that you remove anything that might distract that child or that teenager from being able to hear what it is that you're instructing or how it is that you're trying to discipline, avoid embarrassment. Number 4, communicate grief. You have to do this in twofold. One, you have to communicate your grief. You have to communicate the fact that you're hurt by the fact that your child, your teenager, has done this particular action, and here's why it grieves you, okay? So we need to communicate that. But the second thing is, and we talked about this last night as it related to holiness, the second thing is you have to communicate God's grief when we as human beings sin against Him. And so we want to make sure that we walk through, not in a way that shames, but in a way that does bring an awareness to our children that God is grieved whenever they make choices that go against us as parents, because when they disobey us, they in essence are disobeying God as well, because they're disrespecting us as parents, they're disobeying us as parents, and as children they are instructed to obey us and respect us. And so we want to communicate grief. Fifth, we want to enact the consequence. Now, we're going to camp out here for just a second. Would you guys mind if I grab that stool? Would you grab that? Because I'm going to talk about this for just a second, and my back's hurting just a smidgen. Can you still get me on this, Andy, if I sit on this? We okay? So we want to enact the consequence. Now, the question that I get all the time is, well, what kind of consequences do you use? And I've got a pretty easy answer for that, honestly. I've got a really easy answer. And my answer is whatever works. As a parent, I provide basically for every need that my children have. And so anything is a fair game as it revolves around consequences. I have parents all the time who'll say to me, we've got this behavior that's going on in our child, and we just can't seem to find out what works, and we've tried everything. And my response to that is, no, you haven't. Nobody's ever tried everything, right? Like that number's way too big. Everything is way too big. You think you've tried everything, but I promise you haven't tried everything. When we look at consequences, enacting the consequence, we have to have more than just 1 or 2 or 3 things in our toolbox. Most of the time, what parents have is they have spanking in their toolbox, and they have grounding in their toolbox, and maybe they have taking away a phone or computer privileges or TV or something like that. They'll have, and that's pretty much it. That's pretty much what they do in terms of consequences. And so I really encourage parents, figure out what matters to your child, because what matters to one child may not work for another child. You may tell one child, I'm going to ground you, and because they're really active and they want to be involved and they want to be out and they want to be doing, and that may really work for that child. You may tell one child who's an introvert who really loves being alone, I'm going to ground you. It may be the best thing in the world for them. Well, yay, I'm going to go to my room and I'm going to lay on the bed and I'm going to hang out and I'm going to daydream and vision, and they're completely okay with that. You may have one child that you spank, and it may work. I mean, that spanking, it works every single time. You've got one kid that they would prefer the spanking. I mean, give me the spanking, let me get it over with. I mean, my brother, Kevin, who passed away whenever he was 19, he used to ask for the spanking. I mean, he was just a kid who he wanted to do what he wanted to do, and whenever he messed up, he was like, just give me the spanking and let's move on with it, right? Let's get it over with so that I can continue to live my life. So spanking didn't work for him. And so you have to figure out what works for your child. Now, usually when we talk about enacting the consequence, what gets in the way a lot of times of that is our own convenience. Like, we don't want to enact consequences because of how it impacts us. So, like when we have teenagers who drive cars, and we say, well, we're going to take away your ability to drive. But then that means I've got to go take them places, and I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have that kind of consequence. I don't want to have that kind of inconvenience. And so we don't issue that kind of consequence. Or we say, well, we're not going to take the phone away because they need the phone to be able to communicate with me, because if they can't communicate with me, then this is going on or that's going on. And once again, we're making decisions based on convenience and not necessarily what works. So I really wish Tatum was here so she could give you this testimony. I would actually probably even have her tell you this story. Probably one of the best examples that I can give you is from Tatum's life. When Tatum was in, I think it was the 5th grade, maybe 5th, 6th grade, somewhere along in there. Spotlight effect is it's in full effect, right? Like, she's totally conscious that everybody's looking at her, watching her. She's overly concerned with that. And we were living in Madison, Mississippi, where, kind of how you dress and, how you look. And it's a big deal, you got to wear the right brands, and you want to fit in, right? She's at that age where that's really, really important, in a place where that's really, really important. And she was really struggling with math, and a lot of it had to do not with her ability, but with her, basically with her investment. She wasn't doing homework, and Tatum's math teacher was a member of our church, and so she had contacted us and had said, Tatum hasn't done her math homework for a couple of days. And so we sat Tatum down, we talked to her about it, and she said, okay, I'll change. And, then maybe a few weeks later, we got the contact again, and we sat her down and we talked to her, and then maybe a few weeks later, it happened again, and we got the contact from the teacher, and she said, just want to make you aware, it's been a couple of days, Tatum hasn't turned in her homework. And so we called Tatum down, and we're having the conversation with her, and we're talking to her about it, and I told her, I said, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do. We've taken your phone away from you. We've taken away your TV privileges. We've taken away your reading. Tatum loves, she's a voracious reader. Loves to read. We've taken away her ability to be able to read for pleasure, and she can only read for schoolwork. We had done all that, and I didn't know what else to do. And so we're trying to have the conversation, and I'm trying to pray and think through, what's another consequence we could have. And out of the blue, I'm convinced, in just a spirit of in a moment of Holy Spirit inspiration, Wendy says to Tatum, she says, I want you to go upstairs, and I want you to get your purse, and I want you to get your jacket, and I want you to get your backpack, and I want you to bring all 3 of them down. And so Tatum goes upstairs, and she gets her purse, and she gets her jacket, and she gets her backpack, and she comes downstairs. And Wendy empties the pockets out of the jacket. She empties everything out of the purse. She empties everything out of the backpack. And she says, all 3 of these belong to me, and they are privileges that are given to you. And so you can borrow one of my jackets because it was cold. You can borrow one of my jackets. You can borrow one of Daddy's backpacks, or some other bag that we have around here. And you can take instead of taking a purse, you can either not use a purse, or you can use a brown paper bag, or whatever you want to use. But Tatum flipped out, because where she went to school, everybody had a North Face jacket. All the girls carried a Cavu purse, and all the kids carried North Face backpacks. And suddenly she was giving up her 3 name brands: North Face jacket, North Face backpack, Cavu purse. She went upstairs, and she literally, I think she cried for 3 hours. Wendy said, you're welcome to borrow my blue jean jacket. Wendy and Tatum about the same size. She said, you're welcome to borrow my blue jean jacket. You're not going to be cold, but you're not wearing the North Face. North Face is mine. That's a privilege. We paid extra money so you could wear a name brand. That's a privilege. All we have to do as your parents is we just have to make sure that you're warm. And I can make sure that happens. And your backpack, all we have to do is provide you a way to get your books to and from school. But we don't have to provide you with a name brand North Face backpack. That's a privilege, right? The need is that you get your books back into school. And the purse, you just need something to carry your things in. And, that can happen with a brown paper sack or a Ziploc bag or whatever. But you're not going to carry, the Cavu purse, that's a privilege. She eventually stopped crying, and she came back downstairs, and she said, when can I get all this back? And Wendy said, you can get it back when you demonstrate for us that you can take responsibility for your schoolwork. We should not have to take responsibility for your schoolwork. That is your responsibility. So when you can demonstrate that to us. So every day, for probably 3 weeks, every day Tatum said, when can I get my things back? And every day we said, when you demonstrate responsibility in your schoolwork, that we don't have to take responsibility for it and you can do it, then you can get it back. Do you think that she learned a lesson from that? She absolutely learned a lesson from that. And we had tried taking away the phone and the TV and the books and the grounding from friends, and it didn't matter. And so my argument when we talk about enacting the consequence is you have to find out what works for your child. I'm convinced, and I really do believe I've yet to be proven wrong. I'm convinced every kid has something that they value. Every kid has something. It's either a privilege that they get or an activity that they enjoy that, if taken away from them, can be a motivator to help them learn right behavior. I appreciated back whenever my boys were playing baseball, we had a couple of parents who came to us as coaches who said, the one thing in my kid's life that they really enjoy is playing baseball, and I really don't want to hurt the team, but ultimately we're not going to allow him to play in the game because of this behavior. And we're going to expect our child to come to you as coaches and to the team and to make an apology for not being able to play. But the reason they're not being able to play is because of this behavior. And I always loved parents who said that, and always told parents, listen, I support you 100%. I'm not frustrated as a coach by that at all. At the end of the day, much more important that your kid learn responsibility than he be our starting shortstop tonight on the field. And so those kids would come and they would apologize to us and say, I'm sorry, we can't play. This is a consequence of a behavior in my life that's not supposed to be there. And so this consequence is I'm not going to be able to play in the game tonight. I was leading a conference like this at Broadmoor years ago, maybe 7, 8, 10 years ago. And I had a parent who, after I got finished with this point, he raised his hand. Forrest Collier's his name. Love Forrest to death, great friend. Forrest raised his hand, and Forrest said, I have to disagree with you. I really, the only thing that my son enjoys is taking naps. What, do I need to take that away from him? And I said, yes. If you really believe that that's the only thing he enjoys is taking naps, then try it this week. So the next week they came back. We were doing the parenting conference was on Sunday nights for 2 hours. So the next Sunday night he came back. And right before we started, Forrest raised his hand. He said, can I give a personal testimony? I said, sure. He said, last week I told you we had tried everything and nothing worked, and the only thing that I could find that my son really enjoyed was taking naps. And he said, last week you told me to take that away from him. He said, so this week, whenever he didn't do what he was supposed to do, I told him, you can't take a nap. You can go outside and play. You can go do whatever you want to do, but you're not going to take a nap. And he said to me, you can't take a nap away from me. I mean, that's like inhumane to take a nap away. He said, but I wouldn't let him take a nap. I would not let him take a nap. He said, over the course of the week, he became more and more compliant with what it was that we were trying to get him to do. And so it works. Every kid has something. What does your kid have? You know, what is at your disposal that you can use in terms of consequences? What do your kids value? What do they value? What do they place a premium on? Use those things to enact consequences. Now, the other thing that I would tell you is that whenever we talk about enacting the consequence, is that when we enact the consequence, if you're going to do something like grounding or something like that, let me encourage you. I think it's okay for us to set minimums on those things, but what I don't think is okay is when we just give a definite time frame, because here's what that looks like and feels like to most kids, and I think is accurate. Is basically what they're doing is they're serving time. And serving time oftentimes is not instructive. And so what we try to say to our kids is, you know, you lose computer privileges for 24 hours, or you lose PlayStation privileges for 48 hours, or whatever. But then we always try to attach the caveat of it's this amount of time plus a change in behavior. So it's a minimum amount of time on the front end, but then we have the expectation that the behavior changes on the back end. So especially on things like disrespect. So if your child does something that's disrespectful, or they're hateful, or they're mean, and then you ground them for something for 48 hours or 3 days or a week or whatever, but at the end of the week they're still being mean, and you give the privilege back, what have we taught them? We've not taught them anything. And so I have found that with most parents, if they will use shorter amounts of time for the giving or pulling of consequences, if they'll use shorter minimums and more instructive behavioral changes that are attached to that, the behaviors get learned a lot faster. Okay, so it's, I'm going to ground you for 24 hours from, or 48 hours from, or 72 hours from, 2 days, 3 days, whatever. And at the end of that, we're going to evaluate how you're doing on this specific behavior. Then that tends to work better. It doesn't work on all things, right? I mean, some things it just takes time. Like if it's a grade, you may not know in 72 hours whether or not the grade is better. But one of the things you can evaluate are study habits, right? So like for me, one of the things that was very difficult for me was I always made good grades in school, but I had horrible study habits. But my parents didn't care as long as I made good grades. I wish at some point my parents would have taught me good study habits. That is something that you can monitor. Are they taking responsibility? Are they studying hard? Are they giving their best? Some kids, they don't have to try very hard and they can make the grade. Is it good for them that our focus is only on the grade? It's not, because eventually if they don't establish good work habits and good study habits, they may reach a point academically where they do have to study and they do have to try, but because they've never had to do it up until that point, they don't know how to do it because they've never been taught how to do it. So enact the consequence. Next, sincere repentance. Sincere repentance. What does that mean? Well, we want to see a change in behavior. That's exactly what we were just talking about in terms of not just a saying of I'm sorry, but a saying of I'm sorry and then actually seeing a change in behavior. What is the expectation? This is what you should have done. This is what you did. Now, what do I want to see you do in return? Sometimes our kids really get locked up. Have you ever done this? Have you ever really gotten on to one of your kids and had like the talk with them? And you get to the end of the talk and they're left sitting there and you're looking at them and then they say this, I don't know what you want me to say. You ever had a child say that to you? I don't know what you want me to say. What they're saying is, you've gotten on to me, you've corrected me, but now I don't know what you want me to do to go forward. And so when we get to sincere repentance, we want to give them some steps on how to move forward. Not just a correction in action, but if there is something that we are expecting of them, we want to give them the opportunity to know that and then to do that. Next, unconditional love. One of the things that we always want to follow up any corrective action with is love and affection. We want to make sure that anytime there's a correction that our kids know, I love you, I care about you, and there is not a severing of the relationship between you and me, okay? And so sitting down and talking with them, I've seen parents do this where like, I'm just so disgusted with you, I just can't even look at you, and then they end up leaving the room. And it communicates the absolute wrong message, right? That's not the message that Christ gives to us. It's not that we're not disappointed. We can be disappointed. And I think it's okay if we say to our kids that we're disappointed, that we're hurt, and that we're grieved. But what we also want to make sure they understand is that doesn't impact our love for them. I love you anyway. I love you in spite of that. Hey, you know what? I even knew, because I know I'm a sinner and I know that I'm not a perfect parent, I knew that you were going to have mistakes. I knew there's going to be times whenever you're going to drop the ball. I love you anyway, right? Because that's what Christ does for us. And then consistent follow-up. And this is one where we drop the ball a lot as parents, and that is to go back and to follow up with behavioral change that we are hoping is happening. Oftentimes what happens in disciplining our kids is the issue doesn't come up until the kid has failed again And sometimes we need to go back and check on them. Like if we've said, I want you to do X, I want you to get a better grade, I want you to be more respectful to your mom or dad, I want you to be, show more grace to your friends, I want you to be kinder to your brother, whatever it is. We need to be actively looking at that to see if it's happening so that we can coach along the way if it's not happening. Because what we don't want it to be is that it becomes an issue that we notice because we haven't done consistent follow-up. Like it's not an issue until it's an issue, right? So make sure that we do consistent follow-up. Come along behind them to evaluate that. Hey, how's it going? How's it working? Is there something else that we need to be doing? Let's do consistent follow-up. That's taking corrective action, okay? All right, so how do we give clear instructions? What do we need to do by way of what we teach? One, that's a double line there, so strike through that first, give clear instructions. That's the heading. So one, we need to be united as parents in what we communicate, okay? Be united as parents in what we communicate. What does that mean? Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that children and teenagers specifically, if they're nothing else, they are this. They are manipulative, right? And they know how to scam the system. And so they know which parent they need to ask to get whatever it is that they want to get, right? Which is a total scam. Because at the end of the day, we ought to be unified as parents on what the message is going to be. And so get really good at saying this. Not go ask your mother or go ask your father. Get really good at saying, I don't know yet. I need to talk to your mom or I need to talk to your dad, and then we'll let you know. So when we are giving instructions, we want to make sure that the expectations are clear. If one parent expects it and the other parent doesn't expect it, it's going to send a mixed message to our children. And oftentimes what ends up happening is this: when we're not united, you almost always have one parent who tends to have a little higher expectations, or tends to be a little more strict or a little more consistent in parenting, and you've got one that's a little less, right? And if you're not careful and if you're not communicating well and being consistent in your messages, the more permissive one parent gets, the more strict the other parent gets. And the more strict the other parent gets, the more permissive the other parent gets in response. Why? Because you're constantly trying to balance each other out. And what you don't want to do is balance by going to the extremes. You want to balance by moving toward one another as parents with a more consistent message. So it's not, well, you're too strict, so I'm going to be too permissive. It's going to be, hey, I'll learn to be a little more strict if you'll learn to be a little more permissive, and let's meet in the middle for the sake of our child. So let's be united in what we communicate as parents. Number two, when you do have to say no, when you do have to tell a child that they can't do something, you need to learn to say it firmly, and you need to say it only once. Okay? Now, this just sounds so incredibly easy, but the vast majority of us in this room are what I call counters. You know what that is? It's whenever you tell your kids something and you say 1, 2, 3. And basically what you're teaching them to do is disobey on 1, disobey on 2, and obey on 3. It's classical conditioning. You are conditioning them to obey on 3. And if you can condition them to obey on 3, you can condition them to obey the first time that you say it. Right? I used to have a friend who said all the time, delayed obedience is disobedience. Right? We shouldn't have to count. We should say it once. Now, with that being said, when you say no, you need to say it firmly, and you need to say it once. But particularly in the teenage years, let me say this: you need to find ways of saying yes. You need to find ways of saying yes, so that when you do have to say no, it means something, right? Some of you and I grew up in homes where the instinctual answer from our parents was no. right? I mean, as soon as you asked for something, as soon as you did something, it was an automatic criticism, an automatic critique, an automatic negativity, an automatic no. Some of you grew up in those kinds of homes. Particularly whenever our kids begin to enter into prepubescent, pre-adolescence, adolescent years, we need to learn to find ways of saying yes, right? There are enough things that cause tension in the home than inviting more things that cause tension merely because we weren't willing to compromise a little bit and say yes because it wasn't exactly the way we wanted it. So learn to find ways of saying yes. Compliments of my friend Gary Mays at Broadmoor. Learn to find ways of saying yes to your teenager in particular. But when you say no, make sure that you say no and you say it firmly and you say it only once. And sometimes when asked and it's a yes or a no, then instead of just immediately issuing the answer, then before you actually say yes or no, be willing to have a discussion about that. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of bartering, particularly with your teenager. That's an okay thing. But once you've said the no, that is not the time to do the bartering. The time to do the bartering, the time to do the discussing, the time to be flexible is before you say yes or before you say no. Because when you say no, you want your children to know that you mean no. And here's the reason why. So do that on the front end of that. So maybe your initial thought is no, but don't say no and then be like, but let's talk about it. Say, I'm not sure yet, but let's talk about it. What potentially might be the consequences of that? Who's going to be there? What do you think might happen if this happens? And then arrive at the solution and say, well, yeah, I think that might be okay, provided that you do this, this, and this. Or I think this might be a permissible thing as long as we can agree on these factors. But if you say no, make sure you say it firmly and make sure you say it only once. Number 4, key into teachable moments. Key into teachable moments. What do I mean by that? Man, we miss so many opportunities in our kids' lives where basically at the end of the day, we're having opportunities served up to us on a silver platter and we're just watching them go by. Can I give you a really good example of that relates to the topic of healthy sexuality? You're watching TV, prime time, 8 o'clock at night, your kids are in the room, and something sexually inappropriate comes on the screen. Most parents, their initial response to that is to grab the remote as quickly as possible and change the channel, and then just move on as if nothing happened. A much more appropriate thing to do would be to hit the pause button or to change the channel and then to say, let's have a conversation about why we changed the channel. Because if you just change the channel, what you've communicated to them is sex is bad. But it's not that sex is bad. It's that inappropriate sex is bad. It's that premarital sex is bad. It's that extramarital sex is bad. Adultery is bad. Fornication is bad. But marital sex in the confines of a monogamous, heterosexual, married relationship, that's a great thing. But that's not the message that your kid just got. Because we completely missed the teachable moment to have the conversation. Something happens in one of their friends' lives, and you hear about it. And your immediate thought is, thank God that's not my kid. But you never have the conversation with your child that says, man, I'm just really, really grateful for the fact that, my child was spared this. But why was my child spared this? Let's have a conversation about that. Hey, little Susie, I heard that a friend of yours had this happen in their life, and I wanted to talk to you about that. Look for teachable moments and then take advantage of those when you can. When your kids reach their teen years, give your teen a voice. Give your teen a voice. The older they get, the more of a voice they need to have. What I mean by that? Well, allow their input into the decision-making process. As they gain independence, they need to be given more of a more of a place in the home because they are becoming an adult, right? So when Tatum left to go to England, and she was in England for 6 months, and then she came back, we had a full-grown adult young woman who lived on her own for 6 months in a foreign country, and now she's living back at home again. How would it have been if we would have treated her as if she were 5? She had to have a voice in our home because she's an adult. Now, granted, we're paying the rent, and we're paying the power, and we're paying the cable, and we're paying for the groceries, and so could we have expectations on her? Yes, we could have expectations on her, but it was a different way of having expectations than it was when she was 14. She had a voice. Tatum, what do you think about this? Being able to ask your teenager, what do you think about this? What's your response to this? What's going to be your contribution to this? Give your teen a voice. And then teach the bigger picture. We talked about this earlier. Not just you understanding the bigger picture, but when you're giving clear instructions, help your child understand not just what you want them to do, but what is the rationale behind them doing it. Now, when they're young, it's okay for you to say, because I said so. We all said, right, whenever we were growing up, we all said, I'm never going to say to my kid, because I said so. Everybody says that. And then everybody says to their kids, because I said so, right? And we do that because it's okay for your kids to learn to do things because you said so. That is an okay thing. It's just not okay when they're 14, okay? When they're 13, 14, 15, when they get to the teen years, you need to give them a rationale for why you do. Now, they need to obey it just because you said it, but they need a rationale. Why? Because they need to know the reason why you make the decisions that you make. Because if we don't teach them the reasons why we make those decisions, if we don't teach them the bigger picture, how are they going to know how to apply those same principles in their life whenever you're not around? They're not going to know how. So what are they going to do? They're going to pick up the phone. They're going to call you. What do I need to do in this scenario? That may make you feel really good as a parent because you've got basically parental dependence, but it's not healthy and it's not good for them. So when we set boundaries for our kids, when we set boundaries for our kids, how do we set them, and what do we need to keep in our minds for the boundaries that we give our kids? For instance, things like what time they go to bed, or who they hang out with, or what kind of movies they watch, or how they treat their siblings, or how they treat us. I'm thinking in terms of us giving them specific boundaries that are going to kind of help guide their life. I want to give you 4 anchors that will help you know how to specifically set boundaries, okay? Because it's not just to set boundaries. You have to know how to set them and then enforce them, okay? So 4 things. 1, in boundary setting, we want them to know we love them, right? So the statement there is, I'm on your side. So when I set a boundary, I want you to know the reason I set a boundary is not for me, it's for you. I'm setting a boundary because I'm for you. At the end of the day, I'm for you. I'm on your side. We're on the same team. So many of our teens in particular, but children and teens as well, sometimes they see their parents as the enemy, right? Because you're not allowing me to do the things that I want to do. Even when my teenagers say that, you're not allowing me to do the things I want to do, and they see me as an enemy, I want to be able to say to them, I know you see me as an enemy, but I want you to know I'm on your side. Okay? I'm on your side. I'm giving you this boundary because I believe ultimately it's for your good. And even if you don't understand it, it is a boundary nonetheless, because maybe I know a few things that you don't know. So love, I am on your side, 1. 2, truth. I have some rules and some requirements. I'm on your side, and because I'm on your side, I've got some expectations, and here they are. And I'm going to be clear about them. I love you. Here is what I expect. Okay? I'm going to lay it out for you clearly, as we talked about in giving clear instructions. I'm going to tell you exactly what it is I expect. Here are the rules. Here are the requirements of what I'm telling you. I love you. I'm on your side, but I've got some rules and requirements. Number 3, freedom. And this is where we oftentimes drop the ball. You can choose to respect or reject the rules. That's up to you. Okay? That's your choice. So many parents get so wrapped up in this idea of, I set these rules and I can't get my child, my teenager, I can't get them to do what I want them to do. And I oftentimes have to look them in the eye and say, at the end of the day, it's a choice. Your children, your teenagers, they have the freedom of choice. And the older they get, the freer they become. Right? I love you. I'm on your side. The truth is, here are the requirements. Here are the rules that I'm going to lay out for you. But the freedom to choose is on you. As parents, you can't feel guilty for enacting consequences when your child made a choice to disobey. That is not your fault. That is their choice, right? You were clear. I love you. Here are the expectations. They knew the expectations. They chose to break the expectations. Here's a novel concept for all of us in this room. There is one perfect parent. His name is God. And every day, you and I, as adults with the perfect parent God, are given the freedom to choose to obey the rules and the requirements or not. And when we choose to disobey, it's not God's fault. As independent, free-thinking human beings, it's our choice. So as parents, stop owning a responsibility that's not yours. If you were clear on the front end of what was expected, and they chose to go another direction, then realize your kid's growing up and he's exercising independence and he's exercising his freedom to make a choice. But then the reality, here's what happens when you make the choice. And that is on both ends of the spectrum. Whenever you make the choice good and whenever you make the choice bad. Frequently with my kids, whenever they make the choice that's good, spontaneously, even if I have not told them in advance that they're going to get a specific thing for making a right choice, if they do make a right choice, a lot of times I'll just spontaneously reward them. And then whenever I spontaneously reward them, I'll say, one of the things I want you to learn is, when you do the right things, good things happen. When you make good choices, good things come on the heels of that. Do I have a token system where we reward every single good decision in our family? No, because making good decisions are a reward in and of themselves, right? But there's nothing wrong with adding a little extra incentive in that. Wendy left on Thursday to go to Nashville to an event. And so I was at home all day Thursday after getting in late Wednesday night from Hong Kong. I was at home with Tatum and the boys on Thursday. Tatum had to go to work, so I was there with the boys. And I was tired, man. I was just worn out. But we needed to wash clothes, and I needed to pack, and we had all this stuff that we had to get done. I mean, it was nuts. And a couple of times, my boys jumped in and just, they took the trash out. They said, "Dad, is there any way we can help? Is there?" And it made me feel so good as a dad that they were doing that. And so Thursday night, we were wrapping up for the night, and I was getting ready to tuck them in bed. And Thursday night, I said to them, I said, "Hey guys, I want you to know how thankful I was for how helpful you were today. I mean, you really made my life possible today, and it's going to make us leaving in the morning a lot easier. So what I did tonight," and they're already in bed, I said, "So what I did tonight in preparation for you guys being here tomorrow without Mommy or I or Tatum being here, and a sitter was going to be with them the next day, I said, I put $20 on each one of your PlayStation accounts. And so if you want to get some in-game purchases or something like that, I just wanted you to know I put $20 on your PlayStation account." Well, they were elated for that. And I didn't tell them on the front end, "Hey, if you help me today, I'm going to give you $20, because ultimately I don't want the only reason that they have good behavior to be because there's going to be some payoff in the end, because the good behavior is the payoff. But it did reinforce more immediately the good payoff of good behavior that I was willing to do that. And so help them understand the reality of here's what will happen when you make a good choice or make a bad choice. When you enact a negative consequence, especially, when one of the things that you want to be able to say is, "I'm sorry that I've got to enact this consequence, but the reality is you're the one who made the choice. This is not on me. I'm not going to feel guilty for enforcing the thing that you knew was going to happen. I frequently in counseling have to tell parents, you need to stop feeling guilty for enacting things that you said you were going to enact when your children and your teenager made the choice that they made. Stop feeling guilty about that. They're the ones who made the choice. Here is what will happen. Be clear about that. So 4 anchors of boundary setting. Okay. We got to wrap up here, and I can hit these 5 essential lessons. So whenever we think about boundaries and discipline, let's make sure that on the front end, by the time our child gets out of our home, let's just make sure that there are some things that we've done really, really well in terms of what we teach them, okay? So it can't just be all about, be kind to your brother or sister, or stop hitting them, or share your toys. Ultimately, there are some big life lessons that we just want to make sure. And I try to ask myself, these questions regularly. What am I doing with my children to make sure that I'm teaching these things? 1, teach them to suffer well. Okay? Teach them to suffer well. In our culture, there is a victim mentality that has run rampant. Okay? We want to make sure that our children understand that bad things are going to happen in life. Okay? That's a reality. They're going to suffer. If they live in this world, the sun rises and falls on the just and the unjust. I love the Facebook meme that I saw recently. It said, why do bad things happen to good people? And the caption underneath the bottom said, it's only happened one time and he volunteered for it, right? Because saying why do bad things happen to good people assumes we're good people, and the Bible tells us that we're not good people, right? And so they need to understand suffering is going to happen. So we teach them to suffer well. What can they learn as a result of their suffering? How can they grow from that? How can they not become victims as a result of their suffering too? Teach them to work as unto the Lord. If you're not already doing this with your children and with your teenagers, teach them a good work ethic. I will tell you that today that's one of the things that most troubles me about the upcoming generations is we have generations of children and teenagers that don't have a good work ethic. Okay? They've been allowed to, live at home, rent-free, play video games, no expectations, no chores, no anything. Everything that we give them is gravy, but they become not privileges but expectations, right? And so one of the things, and I use my own kids as the example, like Tatum, she has a real appreciation for things that are given to her. Because when she was growing up, we were poor, struggling seminary students who were so broke we couldn't pay attention. And so very rarely did she have a lot of the privileges that my boys have today that are afforded to them, because financially we're so much better off. We can do so much more for our boys than we could do for Tatum. But what has ended up happening as a result of that is they don't see them as privileges, they see them as entitlements. They are owed these things. Not, wow, thank you for giving me this. That's so generous. They see them as expectations or as entitlements. So teach them to work as unto the Lord. Teach them to be hard workers with a good work ethic that ties a good work ethic with the expectations and outcomes that come out of that. Number 3, teach them to manage their lives wisely. And by manage, I mean teach them the proper understanding of stewardship. Teach them that they're not owners of anything, but they're managers of everything. They're managers of their time, their talent, their resources, their money, their possessions. We talk about all the time, our boys, have said to us on several occasions, things like, hey, do you think we could ever move to wherever? You think we'd ever move to California? You think we could ever? And so we have that conversation with them that says, we don't make those decisions. We go where the Lord calls us. We're not in North Carolina because we love the weather in North Carolina, though we love the weather in North Carolina. We're in North Carolina because North Carolina is where God called us. And so we go where God calls us because we want to manage our lives in accordance with a stewardship perspective that we don't own our lives. God owns our lives. We were bought with a price, the Bible tells us. And so we want to honor God by managing the things that he gives us wisely. 4, teach them to make wise choices. So see the relationship between the choices they make and the outcomes that follow. How do we teach them a decision-making process that teaches them that they need to use wisdom and not just looking at the short-term gain at the expense of the long-term gain. And then number 5, in closing, teach them to live grace-filled lives. Teach them to extend grace to themselves, to you as parents, to their peers, to their siblings. Teach them to live grace-filled lives. I don't want my children to get out of my home and not understand grace. I don't want them to get out of my home and not understand the fact that God loves them so much that he gave them something that they could never earn or do for themselves. I want them to understand that so much of what they have is just as a result of God's goodness and grace in their life. And as a result of understanding that, they then can extend that to other people. Okay? All right. Questions that I can answer for you at this point? I've gone over by 13 minutes, but is there any questions that I can answer for you at this point? Everybody good? It's been great to be with you. Thank you for your attention and for just kind of investing this time. I hope it's been beneficial for you. I'm going to pray for you, and then Ricky, we're doing lunch out there, so we'll have lunch for you out in the outer room. If I can ever be a resource to you in any way, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. No counselors in and around the area with my affiliation with the seminary and relationships that I have there. And so if there's ever any way that I can serve you, would be happy to do that as we come alongside one another and try to be the kind of parents that God wants us to be. Okay? Let me pray for you.